Is that Lord A?
I heard he was not returning to London this season.
Some women are born to be noticed. Others are born to haunt the edges of ballrooms like ghosts at a feast, their presence so thoroughly dismissed that they might as well be part of the wallpaper. Miss Josephine Hartley had long ago accepted that she belonged to the latter category, her 29th year sitting upon her shoulders like a leaden cloak that proclaimed to all of London society that she was precisely what they had always suspected her to be: unremarkable, unmarriageable, and utterly unworthy of a second glance. But on a frost-touched evening in February, when the Duke of Ravenscroft's legendary gray eyes fell upon her for the first time, Josephine discovered that invisibility, like all things, could shatter in an instant, and that being seen by the wrong man, or perhaps the most dangerous man in all of England, could transform one's carefully constructed prison of obscurity into something far more terrifying: the burning, inescapable spotlight of his absolute and undivided attention. The Pemberton Ball glittered with all the excess that London's elite could muster on a winter's evening, chandeliers dripping with 1,000 candles that cast dancing shadows across silk gowns and jeweled throats, while the orchestra played waltzes that stirred the blood and set slippered feet to moving in patterns as old and prescribed as the social order itself. Miss Josephine Hartley stood in her customary position near the potted ferns that flanked the ballroom's eastern wall, her gown of dull bronze silk chosen specifically for its ability to blend into the background, to render her as unremarkable as the furniture, and she held her fan with the practiced grip of a woman who had spent 11 seasons using it as both shield and occupation for hands that no gentleman ever requested the honor of holding. She was not ugly, precisely. Her looking-glass told her that much each morning when she pinned her mousy brown hair into its serviceable knot. No, Josephine's great sin was not ugliness, but rather a more damning crime in the eyes of the ton. She was unremarkable, possessed of neither fortune nor beauty nor connections powerful enough to overcome the simple fact that she had been on the marriage mart for over a decade without receiving a single offer. And nothing marked a woman as undesirable quite so thoroughly as the continued indifference of every eligible gentleman in London. Her chaperone, Aunt Marjorie, sat nearby among the matrons, her attention absorbed by Lady Thornbury's gossip, having long ago given up any pretense that Josephine might actually dance, or converse, or do anything beyond serving as justification for her aunt's continued presence at society's most glittering entertainments. And Josephine had made her peace with this role, or told herself she had, standing in her corner like a piece of abandoned furniture, watching other women, younger women, prettier women, fortunate women, whirl past in the arms of gentlemen who would never think to glance in her direction.
The announcement, when it came, sent a ripple of excitement through the assembled crowd that was so palpable Josephine could feel it even from her distant corner. "His Grace, the Duke of Ravenscroft," the butler intoned with the gravity reserved for only the most elevated of guests, and Josephine, despite herself, despite her determination to remain detached from the evening's proceedings, felt her gaze drawn toward the ballroom's entrance, where a man stood framed in the doorway like a figure from a Gothic novel, all dark evening clothes and aristocratic bearing, and an expression of such cold hauteur that the very air around him seemed to frost and crystallize. Alexander Thorne, Duke of Ravenscroft, was 32 years old and had spent the last decade earning a reputation as England's most eligible and most unapproachable bachelor, a man whose fortune was exceeded only by his title, and whose title was exceeded only by his legendary disdain for virtually everyone beneath his elevated station. He was tall, with hair as black as a raven's wing, and eyes of such pale gray they appeared almost silver in certain lights, and he possessed the kind of severe, angular beauty that made women sigh and poets reach for their quills, though he had famously rejected every match that had been proposed to him with a cold civility that bordered on insult. Josephine watched as the crowd parted before him like the Red Sea before Moses, watched as mothers pushed their daughters forward with varying degrees of subtlety, watched as the Duke acknowledged these offerings with the barest inclination of his head, his expression never warming, his legendary gray eyes never lingering on any of the beauties who preened and postured in his path. He moved through the ballroom with the fluid grace of a predator, and Josephine found herself transfixed despite her usual indifference to such displays of masculine arrogance. The Duke accepted a glass of champagne from a passing footman and positioned himself near the ballroom's western wall, his back to the silk-papered surface, his posture suggesting he was enduring this evening rather than enjoying it. And from her corner, Josephine studied him with the freedom of the unseen, noting the tightness around his mouth that spoke of displeasure or perhaps pain, the way his fingers gripped the delicate champagne flute as if he wished to crush it, the manner in which his gaze swept across the assembled guests with something that looked disturbingly like contempt. She wondered, in an idle, academic way, what it must be like to be so exalted and yet so obviously miserable, to have everything society deemed valuable and still carry oneself as though trapped in a prison of others' making. It was this thought, this moment of distraction, that proved her undoing. For Josephine, lost in her observation of the Duke, failed to notice Lady Thornbury's daughter, Miss Cecily Thornbury, backing away from an overeager suitor with such haste that the girl stumbled directly into Josephine's corner, her elbow connecting sharply with the small table that held Josephine's untouched glass of lemonade. The glass toppled, the sticky liquid splashing across the front of Josephine's Plan's gown, and Miss Thornbury whirled with an expression of horror that transformed almost instantly into relief when she realized whom she had inconvenienced. "Oh," Miss Thornbury said, her voice carrying just enough volume to draw the attention of those nearby. "It's only you, Miss Hartley. I'm sure it will wash out. Or not. I suppose it hardly matters." And with that dismissal, delivered with the casual cruelty of youth and beauty and certainty of one's own importance, Miss Thornbury glided away to rejoin her friends, leaving Josephine standing in a spreading puddle of lemonade with dampness seeping through the silk of her gown. The humiliation burned in Josephine's chest with a familiar ache, the kind she had thought herself too experienced, too hardened to still feel after 11 seasons of similar slights and casual cruelties. She heard the laughter, discreet but unmistakable, rippling through the nearby clusters of guests. Heard someone murmur something about poor Miss Hartley in a tone that suggested they found nothing poor about the situation at all, but rather something grimly amusing. And Josephine felt the old familiar shame rise in her throat, bitter as bile, the shame of being the person to whom things happened, the person who existed primarily as an object of pity or casual cruelty, never as a subject of interest or desire. She had her handkerchief pressed to the worst of the stain, her eyes fixed determinedly on the ruined fabric of her bodice, when she became aware of a presence beside her, close enough that she could smell expensive cologne and something else, something crisp and cold like winter air. The sudden silence that fell over the nearby conversations registered in her consciousness before she could identify its cause, and when she looked up, her breath caught in her throat as her gaze traveled up an evening coat of superfine black wool, past a throat wrapped in pristine white linen, to meet the pale gray eyes of the Duke of Ravenscroft. "That," he said, his voice deep and cultured and carrying just the faintest hint of steel beneath its smooth surface, was inexcusably rude. He was not looking at the spreading stain on her gown, but rather across the ballroom to where Miss Thornbury stood giggling with her friends, and his expression held such cold disapproval that Josephine saw the girl's laughter die mid-breath, her face paling to the color of chalk. Josephine found herself unable to form words, her tongue cleaving to the roof of her mouth with a combination of shock and something that felt dangerously like hope, though she had learned long ago that hope was a luxury women in her position could ill afford.
The Duke turned his attention back to her, and she felt the full force of his regard like a physical touch. There was pale gray eyes moving over her features with an intensity that made her feel simultaneously exposed and strangely visible, as though he were seeing things about her that even she had forgotten existed. "Your gown is ruined," he observed, and there was something in his tone that suggested he found this fact genuinely offensive, as though the destruction of her unfashionable bronze silk mattered to him in ways she could not begin to comprehend. "And that thoughtless chit has not even the grace to apologize properly." He glanced around the ballroom with an expression of such withering disdain that several nearby couples suddenly found reasons to examine their shoes or the ceiling's painted cherubs. It seems civility has become as rare as intelligence in these gatherings.
"It is of no consequence, Your Grace," Josephine managed, her voice emerging smaller and more uncertain than she would have liked. She was acutely aware of the stares they were attracting, of the way conversations had stuttered to a halt as London's most eligible bachelor stood conversing with London's most persistent wallflower, and she felt panic beginning to flutter in her chest like a trapped bird. "I am quite accustomed to such mishaps. Please do not trouble yourself on my account." Something flickered in the Duke's eyes, an emotion she could not name, but that looked oddly like recognition, as though he had heard something in her words that resonated with his own experience. "Accustomed to mishaps," he repeated slowly, "or accustomed to being treated as though you do not signify." The question hung in the air between them, sharp as a blade and twice as dangerous, and Josephine felt her carefully constructed composure begin to crack under the weight of his perception. No one had ever asked her such a thing. No one had ever acknowledged the systematic erasure of her existence that had defined the last decade of her life. And the fact that this man, this impossible, unreachable, legendary Duke, had seen it with such clarity, left her feeling stripped bare and vulnerable in ways that terrified her more than any amount of social ridicule ever had. "I do not know what you mean, Your Grace," she said, though they both knew she was lying, and the small, sad smile that curved his mouth suggested he found her attempt at deflection more poignant than convincing. Around them, the ballroom had fallen into a silence so complete that Josephine could hear the crackle of candles in the chandeliers overhead, could feel the weight of 100 curious gazes boring into her back, could sense Aunt Marjorie's shock radiating across the space between them like heat from a furnace. The Duke extended his hand, palm upward, in a gesture that was simultaneously a question and a command. "Dance with me," he said, and it was not a request, but rather a statement of intent, and Josephine stared at that outstretched hand as though it were a serpent that might strike, her mind unable to reconcile the impossibility of what was happening with the concrete reality of his gloved fingers waiting for hers. "Unless you would prefer to stand here in your ruined gown while these vultures continue to circle and whisper." She should refuse. Every instinct screamed that accepting his offer would only make her situation worse, would only draw more attention to her, would only lead to greater humiliation when he inevitably grew bored and remembered she was nobody worth noticing. But Josephine found her hand moving of its own volition, found her fingers settling into his palm, and felt his hand close around hers with a firmness that sent warmth flooding up her arm and into her chest, where her heart had begun to beat with wild, terrified abandon. But before the Duke leads our invisible heroine onto the dance floor, subscribe so you never miss what happens when England's most sought-after bachelor chooses the woman everyone else has overlooked. And tell us in the comments, have you ever felt invisible in a crowded room? Now, let's see what happens when Josephine steps out of the shadows.
The Duke led Josephine onto the dance floor with a proprietary confidence that parted the crowd as effectively as his title, and she followed in a daze of disbelief, her hand still clasped in his, her ruined gown forgotten in the face of this unprecedented, incomprehensible development.
The orchestra, as if sensing the momentousness of the occasion, struck up a waltz, and Josephine felt the Duke's hand settle at her waist with a touch that was both proper and possessive, his other hand holding hers aloft as they began to move together in the prescribed pattern of the dance. She had waltzed before, though not often, and never with anyone who mattered, but dancing with the Duke of Ravenscroft was an entirely different experience, like comparing a candle's flame to the sun's brilliance. He moved with the fluid grace of a man utterly comfortable in his own skin, and he led with such certainty that even Josephine's nervousness could not make her stumble. His pale gray eyes remained fixed on her face throughout, studying her with an intensity that made her feel as though she were the only person in the ballroom, as though the hundreds of watching guests had ceased to exist and only the two of them remained, turning slowly beneath the chandelier's golden light. "You are wondering why I asked you to dance," the Duke observed, his voice pitched low enough that only she could hear it above the music. It was not a question, but a statement, delivered with the same unsettling perceptiveness he had demonstrated earlier, and Josephine found herself nodding before she could think better of such honesty. A ghost of a smile touched his mouth, though it held more sadness than amusement. "Perhaps I am tired of dancing with women who see only my title. Perhaps I wished to dance with someone who sees me as little as I see myself." The words struck Josephine with unexpected force, revealing a loneliness in the Duke that mirrored her own, though his isolation was born of elevation, while hers stemmed from dismissal. She looked up at him properly for the first time, truly looked at him, and saw past the cold aristocratic beauty to the man beneath, the one who stood at the pinnacle of society and found the view unbearably empty. "You think I do not see your title?" she asked, finding her voice at last, her natural intelligence overcoming her shock. "Everyone sees your title, Your Grace. It is rather like trying not to notice the sun." The Duke's smile deepened fractionally, and Josephine caught a glimpse of what he might look like if he ever truly smiled, if the ice that encased him ever melted enough to reveal genuine warmth. "Yet you are the first person in 5 years to acknowledge that truth, rather than pretend my title is irrelevant while simultaneously calculating its worth," he replied. They turned together through a complex series of steps, and his hand at her waist tightened almost imperceptibly, as though anchoring her to him. "Tell me, Miss Hartley, for I confess I do not know your given name, do you always speak so directly, or have you decided that invisibility grants you certain freedoms the visible cannot claim?"
"Josephine," she said, the name emerging before she could consider the impropriety of offering it. "And yes, I suppose invisibility does have its advantages. When no one is watching, one need not perform." The admission cost her something, laid bare a truth she had never spoken aloud, and she saw understanding flash in the Duke's eyes, recognition of a kindred spirit who had also learned to perform for an audience that never truly saw him. The waltz ended far too quickly, though it felt to Josephine as though they had been dancing for hours, suspended in a bubble of strange intimacy that the return of silence threatened to shatter. The Duke did not immediately release her, his hands remaining at her waist and in hers for a moment longer than propriety dictated, and Josephine saw something flicker across his features, a hesitation that looked foreign on a man so accustomed to certainty. "I find myself reluctant to return you to your corner," he said quietly, and the admission seemed to surprise him as much as it surprised her, "though I suspect that makes me unforgivably selfish." Before Josephine could formulate a response, Aunt Marjorie materialized at her elbow with unprecedented speed, her face flushed with excitement and calculation, her eyes gleaming with a mercenary light that made Josephine's stomach clench with familiar dread. "Your Grace," her aunt simpered, dropping into a curtsy so deep it bordered on theatrical. "How extraordinarily kind of you to take pity on my dear niece. Such a charitable gesture will not be forgotten."
The words were meant as praise, but landed like blows, each one emphasizing Josephine's unworthiness, her need for pity, her status as an object of charity rather than genuine interest. Josephine felt heat flood her cheeks, felt the fragile confidence the Duke's attention had kindled begin to crumble under her aunt's words, and she tried to extract her hand from his, tried to retreat back into the safety of invisibility before the inevitable humiliation of his agreement with her aunt's assessment. But the Duke's fingers tightened around hers, preventing her withdrawal, and when he turned to face Aunt Marjorie, his expression had frozen into something so cold and forbidding that the older woman actually took a step backward, her simper fading into uncertainty. "Madam," the Duke said, his voice carrying the kind of Arctic civility that could strip flesh from bone, "you misunderstand the nature of my actions. I did not dance with Miss Hartley out of pity, but rather because she is the only woman in this ballroom whose conversation does not bore me to the point of physical pain, and whose presence does not inspire me to contemplate early departure." He paused, allowing his words to sink in, his pale gray eyes boring into Aunt Marjorie with such intensity that the woman seemed to shrink beneath his gaze. "I would advise you to reconsider how you speak of your niece, particularly in my hearing, unless you wish to find yourself and your family no longer welcome in the circles you so clearly value."
The threat was delivered with perfect calm, but its impact was devastating. Aunt Marjorie's face cycled through several shades of red before settling on a mottled purple, her mouth opening and closing soundlessly like a landed fish, and Josephine felt a wild, inappropriate urge to laugh rising in her throat, shock and gratitude and disbelief combining into something close to hysteria. No one had ever defended her before, certainly not against her own family, and the fact that this defense came from the Duke of Ravencroft, a man she had spoken to for all of 20 minutes, felt so surreal that she half wondered if she had dreamed the entire evening. The Duke turned back to Josephine, dismissing her aunt with the same casual thoroughness one might dismiss a servant, and his expression softened marginally when his gaze met hers. "I would very much like to call upon you tomorrow, if you would permit it," he said, and the request, phrased as a question despite his clear expectation of acceptance, sent Josephine's heart into a wild gallop that made breathing difficult. "I find I have many more questions for you, Josephine, and very little patience for waiting to ask them." The Duke did indeed call the following afternoon, arriving at Aunt Marjorie's modest townhouse in a carriage so ostentatiously ducal that the neighbors gathered on their stoops to gawk and whisper, and over the subsequent weeks he continued to call with a regularity that transformed Josephine's invisible existence into something unbearably visible, something that blazed with an intensity that both thrilled and terrified her. They walked in Hyde Park during the fashionable hour, his arms supporting hers, while society watched with undisguised amazement. They attended the theater, where he ignored the performance entirely in favor of discussing literature and philosophy, with a passion that suggested he had been starving for intelligent conversation. They danced at every ball, always the first waltz, always together, and Josephine discovered that being seen by Alexander Thorne, Duke of Ravencroft, was like standing in sunlight after years in shadow, warm and bright and utterly transformative. But it was during a quiet afternoon in her aunt's cramped drawing room, rain pattering against the windows and tea growing cold between them, that Alexander finally spoke the words that had been building in his eyes for weeks. "I was in love once," he said, his gaze fixed on some distant point beyond the window. "She died before we could marry, and I thought that made me noble, remaining faithful to her memory. But the truth, Josephine, the truth I have been too coward to admit even to myself, is that I have been hiding behind her death, using grief as an excuse to never risk my heart again." He turned to look at her then, and his pale gray eyes held a vulnerability that stole her breath. "Until I saw you in that corner, invisible and alone, and recognized myself in your isolation." Josephine felt tears gather in her eyes, understanding washing over her like a benediction.
You saw me because you knew what it meant to be unseen, she whispered, the truth of it settling into her bones with profound certainty. Even at the height of society, you were as invisible as I was, trapped behind your title and your grief. Yes, said Alexander simply, and then he was kneeling before her chair, taking her hands in his with a gentleness that made her heart ache. Marry me, Josephine, not because I pity you or because you are convenient, but because you are the first person in a decade who has seen past my title to the man beneath, who has spoken to me with honesty rather than calculation, who has made me want to step out of the shadows I have been hiding in. His voice dropped to a whisper, raw with emotion. Marry me, and let us be visible together, two people who were lost in the crowd until we found each other. And Josephine, who had spent 29 years being overlooked and dismissed, who had made peace with dying invisible and unmourned, found herself saying yes to the Duke who had noticed her when no one else did, who had seen her isolation because it mirrored his own, who had chosen her not despite her invisibility, but because of it, because they recognized in each other the profound loneliness that comes from being unseen, and together they would ensure that neither of them would ever be invisible again. Dear listener, sometimes the most profound love stories begin not with grand gestures or love at first sight, but with the simple act of being seen. If this story of the invisible spinster and the lonely duke touched your heart, please subscribe to our channel and share it with someone who needs to remember that being overlooked by everyone else simply means you're waiting for the one person whose gaze will matter. Leave a comment telling us, when did you first feel truly seen by someone? May you find the courage to step out of the shadows, and may you recognize the invisible souls around you who are waiting, as Josephine was, for someone to finally look their way. This has been a tale of love and visibility, and we thank you for allowing us to share it with you.